Awareness is the greatest mental skill you can have. It's a superpower because through awareness, you have choice. Through choice, you have power. Through power, you can create change.
Hello there, it's me, Steve Malla, and welcome in to Growth Ready. On this episode, I'm excited to welcome in the performance architect Jason Sousa to help us better understand the role that pressure plays on us.
Pressure reveals where you're not prepared, right? And I think that's the surface of it. For me, at the deeper level, pressure will reveal where your identity is not safe.
Jason helps us understand just how far beneath the surface we must go to understand how we protect ourselves from what's possible at the surface, while giving us the insights and understanding to grow into the high performer we are ready to become. Hello there, and welcome back into the most recent installment of the Growth Ready podcast. So excited today to have Jason Sousa joining us on the show, because this is a wonderful opportunity for us to tie in my greatest love in life, which is that of sport and the world that Jason operates in. We're both former athletes, and I have no doubt we're going to align in a variety of ways when it comes to that. But before I start going too deep into who you are, Jason, and all the value you're going to bring today, I have to ask you the question that I ask everybody as we get started. And that is, what does it mean to you to be growth ready?
Yeah, great question. And thank you for having me on the podcast, Steve. For me, being growth ready is not just in terms of being ready, but to set that as your actual goal and your objective. Because when your goal becomes growth, there's no end in terms of your potential. And it always puts you into this state of excitement, because whether you win or you lose, you're always growing. And so I always like my athletes to have that as an objective. Okay. Endless growth. So that's what it means to me. Be ready for endless growth.
I love that you went straight to the goal. I think this is I've asked this question now, closing in probably over a little over 100 times. And so for me to actually have someone go directly towards making it the goal and finding that comfort as well. And I'd love to start here, the comfort around the endless piece too, because athletes, they work on time, they work on wins and losses, they work on black and white. And you're telling me that there's a world that we need to step into that is, in fact, endless. So when you're working with an athlete, how on earth do you get them comfortable with this notion of endless being the goal?
Yeah, great question. For a lot of athletes, we always talk about reaching your potential. The truth is you'll never reach your potential, because that is to say that you stop growing, right? Mm-hmm. And so, we're never actually going to reach our potential, which can be seen as a negative. I look at it from the perspective of positive. That means you can always get better. Like if Michael Jordan had more years in his prime, that means he could have got even better, which is a scary thing to think of, but it's real, right? And so for me, when I talk to athletes, we can talk about having an end goal or an objective in terms of an outcome, as you know very well, because you're in this world, you can't guarantee it, but who do you become in that process, right? And that for me is really exciting. For me, I want to be the number one performance coach in the world, and I'll probably never get there. But who I'm forced to become and how and what that force is in terms of growth for me, I mean, that's a huge one.
Yeah, it's encouraging to hear the clarity that you have around the becoming piece. For me, I always find that in the corporate space, people want the tangible return presented at the outset. They need to know that this is going towards a finish line of some sort. And in the becoming of, we immediately embrace the fact that there is no finish. And that's the endless piece, is that if we are constantly becoming, as you put it, if we're constantly in pursuit of, then the earlier we can find that comfort and acceptance of that is an endless task, I think the more grace immediately we start to give ourselves, is that every opportunity, and I'd love to go here with you, is that every opportunity is a true opportunity for learning when the endless piece is actually the goal.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. And as I tell my athletes, it's, you don't know how great you can be in your sport, right? But be excited about finding out, like, how great can you be in the sport, right? And that all of a sudden is this endless drive forward, because you're in a sense, you're never there, but it's exciting. It's like, hey, find out, can you get even better? Can you get even better? And so, yeah, as you mentioned, it's everything is wins and losses along that journey. And when your objective is growth, you can't lose. right? And
Mhm.
so for an athlete who's looking for growth or mastery versus an athlete who is looking for achievement, one of those is going to outlast the other, right? And it's always that one that is looking for that mastery and that growth that's always going to have the long-term success.
Yeah, and looking back on your life now as a whole, when was it you started to formulate this perspective? Typically, this isn't something you wake up with and just see the world this way. So, walk us through how you yourself got to this perspective that you're sharing with us right now.
Yeah, no, for sure. I didn't start walking and then see the world from this perspective. Too late from the perspective of being an athlete,
Yeah.
unfortunately. And even perhaps later on as a coach, in terms of really seeing that perspective, but just being able to do enough research and understanding how we are designed as human, and how the humans are how we our architecture internally and how we're driven, and seeing those who last the longest in sports in terms of who I've worked with and who I've researched, and from there just being able to see the difference with someone who's just driven by that endless growth, and how do I become even better versus someone who needs, I would say, doesn't even want, but someone who needs certain achievements to be able to validate some of their insecurities.
Yeah. So, when you look back to that season of life where you were the athlete, because by the way, I think we relate with the same being the same athlete. There's a lot of what we're discussing today and that I get to discuss and work on today that I would give a lot of money to be able to go teach my 19-year-old self the very same thing. But when you think back to that time as an athlete, what was it about that environment that potentially prevented you from embracing this very perspective?
A lot of things for sure. One of the things that I've really learned now that I didn't know back then, and I think, you and I will relate, and we talk about being that 19-year-old athlete. Well, one thing is when you're an athlete, you never stop being an athlete, right? And so,
Mm,
for us, the dream is just a little bit behind us, right?
mhm.
Maybe it's still there, but is understanding the difference between what I consciously want versus what I subconsciously am trying to avoid. And that was a big difference for me. So, I consciously wanted, the professional contract and the career. I didn't understand some of the protection patterns sitting underneath the surface that were pulling me back. And so for me, that became the big difference in terms of really understanding athletes. It's less about what we consciously are trying to achieve, but subconsciously, what are these constraints that are pulling you down, which is creating those limitations? And until you explore that, that typically becomes the limitation to performance and potential.
Yeah, and the constraints piece, clearly it's not conscious. It is something that's operating beneath the surface, which is why I love that you've used this word architect already, and I know it's a big part of what you do today around being a performance architect. It's such an intentional word for this kind of work. It immediately implies that this is structural, this is foundational. Like there is no other way of looking at the term architect and not seeing precisely that. So for someone who is feeling as though a mirror is being put up in front of them right now through some of the descriptions that you're giving, despite where they may find themselves in life, how on earth do we get to that point where we suddenly say, you know what, enough's enough? Like it's time for me to really check in and look at myself foundationally and really start doing this work. I'm just curious, like what is that what is that typical point of arrival when someone comes to work with you with this type of stuff?
Yeah, yeah. I think, as you mentioned, in terms of outside of athletics, I believe it's often said that, when the fear of staying the same is greater than the fear of change, that's typically when someone starts to look in the mirror and start to wonder why, they're stuck. In terms of athletes, typically the athletes that I work with are ones who, if they've done all the preparation, the talent is there in terms of them being able to execute without pressure. Oftentimes they've worked with sports psychologists or mental performance coaches. And so they have all the tools, and still there's that resistance there when pressure hits. And, it's that frustration. And certainly I can relate, and perhaps you as well, that frustration of knowing there's another version of you in terms of performance, but it can't seem to get that out when it matters most. And, I think at that point, a lot of my messages on Instagram starts to really resonate with parents and athletes. And that's when they reach out to understand what's going on, because there's levels beneath mindset that I wasn't aware of until, number one, I failed first. And then secondly, unfortunately, that I failed some of the athletes that I worked with in terms of mindset. And some of the most gifted, some of the most dedicated athletes still, with all the preparation, still were holding back when the moment really mattered, which told me there's layers deeper than this. And that put me on this whole journey. And I'm glad I did.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a really hard awareness to sit with for probably anyone. I was about to say most people, but I'd have to assume anybody to just simply know that there's another version of you that you can't seem to access. And I think for me, when I think about our listeners, when I think about those that I've come across, and when I think about myself, like that is a reality. That is a gut check that is so hard to sit with. And I, I mean, I want to learn from your perspective, but I feel like we probably sit with that for too long. Like it rarely do we have that awareness and then immediately go find a Jason Sousa the very next day. Like we sit with it for a long time. You alluded to that balance between the comfort and then the need for the change. Like for you, at least from your world, and I think we can then bridge it over to this more corporate, if not, just holistic perspective. You find that people typically are holding on to this kind of an awareness that they know there is another version of me. And for whatever reason, for the life of me, I can't seem to access that version of me.
Yeah. For a lot of people, never.
Mm,
Unfortunately, I think for a lot of people, if as I start to understand us as humans a little bit better, oftentimes we get so stuck in the story that it no longer feels like a story. It starts to feel like our truth, and we lack the awareness to see the difference. And even for a lot of the athletes that come in, they understand that there's this barrier in terms of performance, but they lack the awareness of why and what's going on, and the understanding of the patterns that they're seeing, like the patterns that we have. They're not random, right? All these patterns that keep showing up, they're trying to give you some information. But when you're so consumed with, the way that I think is me or the way that I feel is me, it's hard to create that separation. So a lot of people never get to that place, I would say. And only
mm,
from, I don't know if I didn't do the research and go through that journey and be very intentional about reading the books that I did and some of the courses that I did, that I would be in this place myself. So
mm.
in terms of where that point is, you know what? That's a hard question.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll throw that one back at you. When was the point that you started to become aware of that?
Yeah, and I love when a guest does that, because for me, as I'm speaking through this with you, I'm immediately internally reflecting as well, and for me, it took me getting to that point of I became kind of sick and tired of the result. It wasn't as much about the awareness of me knowing I had another version to get to. It was the fact that by me settling for that version, the results that I was getting from that version was so unfulfilling. I was seeing
Mm.
firsthand that as we put it, like my potential is something I can't reach. But going back to when I was 8 years old in school, I was being told, "Oh, you have such great potential," and Steve seems to be just not fulfilling his potential. And and I don't want to make this into a documentary on Steve's childhood. But the point I'm making is that we build up the concept of potential in our minds, and sometimes it can seem so massive because of the influence of others around us that it almost is enough to deter us from even pursuing it in the first place. It's almost
Okay.
overwhelming. We don't know where to start. And so for me, I needed to come to that realization, as I did probably around 5 or 6 years ago, when I felt as though the results I was getting from life were far beneath the results that I was capable of achieving. And I'd known that I was capable of more for a really long time. And for me, that was when common sense kind of took over. It's like, well, you're getting the results for the version of you that you're investing in. What would happen if you were investing in a greater version of you?
Yeah, I love that, and that's such a great perspective. And I think for a lot of us, we're always under the impression. One, you talked about that potential. I see it with the athletes. Like at some point, being told about your potential for so long starts to create protection, right? And
Mm,
and the very talent that you have starts to become the cage that keeps you stuck. Because at some point, at the deepest level, we're all trying to avoid the feeling of whether it's not enough or I don't belong, And so, that often comes the cage to a lot of us in terms of our potential. But I love the fact that you had that intuitive kind of pull forward, which I think we always have, right? And we're always telling athletes, go and chase your greatness as though it's something external for you to go and grab, right? And I always tell the athletes I work with is that seed is already in you, right?
Mm.
It's about removing what is in your way internally in terms of being able to express that, which is different. And for me, I think that's really, really important. Otherwise, we're always the victim of circumstances, and we're not. And that's really important.
Yeah, I'm going to need you to elaborate more on this idea of potential can become a form of protection, because I found myself very convicted in that moment when you shared that. I just sat here thinking, yeah, like even that little story I told you in my childhood, it's just like I always had that to fall back on. Like everyone was telling Steve, hey, you're going to do great things. You're going to be this, you're going to be that. And it's just like, okay. But then at what point is that in itself protecting you from where it is you're trying to go? And maybe I'm misunderstanding what you mean by that, because I would love for you to further expand upon that. I think that's something that our listeners need to better understand.
No, we're on the same page. So, for you as an example, being told, in terms of, you can be great and you have the potential to be great. At some point, your system learned that, well, if I'm not great, that means that I failed. And if I failed, what does that mean about me? That I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, right? And that feeling in terms of the way that we're wired in terms of human is such a dangerous feeling in the sense that it feels unsafe, that you start to create these adaptations in terms of how do I avoid that. And for someone like yourself, if I have to be great, the idea of me not being great becomes scary. And so how do I protect myself from that? And so in a sense, I don't go all in, for example, because if
Mhm.
I go all in and I fail, that what does that mean about me? And I don't
Right.
want to experience that. And I see this all the time. We intentionally hold ourselves back because the idea of going all in and falling short is worse than holding back and thinking, well, I still have potential.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad that you helped us better understand that, because for me, it immediately allows me to just go to my time in coaching of swimming as well. And I think back to, and I've as I've done this work around building out who I am and what I do today, it's amazing to go back and look at the coach that I was in that world of sport, because what I always found fascinating was that I would always get athletes would see me just lose my temper at certain points, you know, typical stereotypical coach. But it was never because someone wasn't trying hard enough or someone did something wrong. It was because I saw someone choosing to not pursue their potential. That's what would crush me as a coach. I would just feel it in my absolute core, is like, you just made a choice there to settle beneath a standard that I know, and because you've shared with me, you're capable of upholding. And that would always kill me as a coach. Maybe I could have communicated that better at times. However, that I saw so much evidence of this, Jason, over my time as a coach, is that there is that protection mechanism that an athlete with the talent, with the potential, and even the desire to achieve it can still be guilty of falling into some of those protection behaviors, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would even argue that it's not a conscious choice; it's a subconscious constraint, right?
Mm.
And so, like, we don't understand it, but for every, I use athletes because I work in the world of athletics, but for all of us, within our system, there's already a threshold in terms of how much exposure feels safe to us based on certain things that we've registered, right? And so we will come up to the point of failure or the point of judgment or the point of disappointment up until that the system says, hey, there's our threshold, and it will start to intentionally pull you back in different ways, right? And that might look at terms of like, I drop my standards, or they seem to be lacking discipline and on the surface. So we always look at the surface and we get angry at the surface, but then we try to manage the surface. Like, well, you lack discipline. Let me give you more systems. My world is what's causing you to lack the discipline in the first place. Let's dive into that, because that's the root. That's the root that I want to get to. I don't want to just manage your symptom. I want to get to the root of why that symptom is there in the first place.
Yeah, we're going to come back to this idea of becoming angry at the surface, and then this this human tendency to then immediately diagnose and prescribe at the surface. I think that is a fascinating concept that I want to really get to. Before we go there, though, I want to think more about that environment that might create those moments where we do get angry at the surface. And I want to go to pressure, because clearly pressure is a big part of the work that you do today. Walk me through just conceptually, like, I think, because it's one of these words, Jason, where you hear it all the time. You can't handle the pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Help us maybe better understand when we use a term like pressure, what are we actually saying? Like, what does pressure maybe represent in terms of the environment within which we might be feeling it, if you will?
Yeah, for me, pressure, we're often told pressure reveals where you're not prepared, right? And I think that's the surface of it. For me, at the deeper level, pressure will reveal where your identity is not safe. Okay. And so, and I'll give you an example. You know, if it was just preparation, like me, for example, I'm a terrible golfer, right? I'm a terrible golfer. But if you put me on the PGA Tour, I wouldn't feel any pressure in terms of I'm unprepared for it, right? In fact, I'd feel less pressure than those there. So it's not just in terms of preparation, right? It's my identity feels safe. I have nothing to lose there. My worth is not on the line. My sense of belonging is not on the line. There's nothing there that would be registered as unsafe. And oftentimes, you know, in terms of confidence, my favorite definition of confidence as it relates to performance is confidence is a permission slip that your nervous system gives you to just fully express what you're capable of. That's it. And if it doesn't think you're safe based on the story that you're stuck in, it will not give you that freedom, which is the very definition of us going into a protective state.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad I asked that question. For me, honestly, like to hear you describe pressure is a revealing of where identity isn't safe. And by the way, we don't only relate in a variety of other ways that I was already aware of. We also relate in terms of our perspective on golf too, in terms of our personal abilities and how we treat it. It's why I never get angry on the golf course. I'm like, I don't put the work in. Like, I don't, you know, why would I be angry about an outcome when I'm not putting the work in on the front end, you know? But the idea that pressure reveals this identity where we're not feeling as safe or we feel unsafe. Anyone listen to this now as a leader, an aspiring leader, anyone listen to this as a business owner or an aspiring business owner, I think you are speaking to them so directly right now in such a wonderful way for them to immediately appreciate where the work begins. Because that's where I was hoping we would go by me asking that question, is we're reinforcing where the work needs to begin when we look at pressure the right way. Am I getting that right?
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah. And I'll use an example of an entrepreneur that I do work with in terms of a business owner, and he's one of those guys, which I'm sure relates to a lot of your listeners in terms of, you know, I can't slow down. I got to keep going, and I'm highly driven, and you know, for him, his discomfort, you know, or his pressure wasn't doing more work, right? We always think when we talk about like you have to get uncomfortable, so we just put in more work. Like I'm going to do it. For him, his opportunity, his discomfort, his pressure was letting go. It's like you want to grow, but you're not comfortable letting go of such control. And why do you need such control? That's not a standard. That is a coping mechanism for a place that you're not safe. And so the moment you're able to get uncomfortable with letting go is the moment you're going to grow. And that's the real discomfort, right? Can you sit with that discomfort? Because you can work 18 hours a day. I know you can. Can you work 8 hours a day and let some of the other people take some of the load off of you? That is discomfort.
Yeah, that's so good. And it allows me now to come back to this idea of how we might get angry at the surface and then diagnose what's happening at the surface, and the need for us to really consider more those levels beneath the mindset. And so help us understand, because it sounds as though you're using mindset as a tool that operates at the surface. And so when you put it that way, help us and our listeners better understand what are some of those other levels that are going on beneath the mindset itself.
Yeah. So oftentimes we look at, in terms of corrections, we look at, behaviors. What are the behaviors? And let's try to change the mechanics or the systems. And then beneath that, in terms of your perspective. So let's change your mindset as an example. But even further than that, there's all these other layers that are going on. And so at the deepest level is that subconscious identity of not who do you think you are, but who did you become to feel safe first and foremost, because that's sitting in your system. And whether you realize it or not, from there, your system, when I talk about your system, your brain is always, designed for protection before performance. And so it's always looking to keep you safe in terms of physical harm, but also in terms of maintaining the identity that has always kept you safe. And so your brain is always scanning. And anytime there's a threat to that, that's going to activate a sequence. Your nervous system is going to activate. You're going to feel in terms of somewhere in your body. You're going to get flooded with certain emotions, typically fear, doubt, anxiety. And then at that point, your mind begins to narrate based on protection. And that's what I say in terms of reverse engineering all of these things. It's when I meet with an athlete and they start to, before they even speak to me, I can tell them what their mind is telling them in certain situations, right? Mm-hmm. Don't mess up. This is a huge moment. That is simply the language that your internal system uses to describe where your identity is not safe. It is literally trying to protect you from going into a place where your identity is going to feel exposed. And once you start to see these patterns, they start to become very obvious. You can start to reverse engineer back to where your identity is not safe, which is creating all of the things that you see on the surface. So as you mentioned, in terms of the surface, a lot of us, what we try to do is we're fanning the smoke, but we don't put out the fire, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're just consistently fanning the smoke and it shows up again. And it's like, why is this here again? It's because you haven't put out the fire. Until you put out the fire, you're going to continuously try to fan out the smoke.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, one of the hardest things about this discussion so far, Jason, is I keep writing down like 3 or 4 notes every single time you answer a question, and I want to go in 3 or 4 different directions every single time you answer a question. But I'm going to try my best here to stay on this idea of protect over perform, because I think that really speaks to our listeners. Because from how I understood what you just said, there is this idea that we have evolved in a way where we would rather protect than we would rather perform. Am I getting that right?
I would argue we are designed for protection over performance. Yeah. And so when you look at your system from your brain to your nervous system to your mind, all of that is designed for protection first and foremost, right? Like as mammals were designed for survival. And so the brain is always asking, how do I maintain survival in this situation, both physical and in terms of identity? And whatever identity we first developed, even when we're younger, right? There's certain things registered in us in terms of we need belonging, we need a sense of connection, we need a sense of certainty. Anytime those get triggered, it creates an emotional imprint within us, and that we start to, as young kids, that's an uncomfortable feeling. We start to internalize that. I don't want this again. How do I avoid experiencing this again? And what does this mean about me? And that starts to form the adaptations that you start to see in terms of behaviors, right? And so when you look at someone who's a perfectionist, as an example, that's not a standard that you chose. That was somewhere along the line you adapt to the idea that it does not feel safe to make mistakes, and I don't want to be judged, and I don't want to feel unworthy. And if I can just be perfect, maybe I can maintain that sense of belonging, that sense of worth, which feels safe within me. And the problem for that is that we grow up and, we're in these adult bodies still living that story. We don't see it, but it's still dictating all our behaviors underneath the surface.
Yeah, and I'm glad I asked the way I did, because it allows us to go back to your point earlier of it not being a choice. Like design, the designing of implies the lack of choice, like when it's a Correct. Design. And so for you to now lead with this idea of being a performance architect, it all makes sense now. It all makes sense in terms of just the idea that if we need to go to the heart of the actual design, the design that, from what we're learning here, happened without really our control. It happened Correct. Mainly because of our circumstances and our environment. For us to now sit here and go, well, if I want to perform at an optimal level, if I want growth to be this pursuit that is in fact endless, I need to go to, in a very intentional, conscious way, to the heart of the design that is currently trying to protect me and start to move towards the heart of the design that is allowing me to perform.
Bingo. Bingo,
Yeah.
you absolutely nailed it in the sense that before you can, what we often try to do is we try to build this identity or this purpose on top of the invisible constraints underneath, right? And
Hmm.
so my work is before we can install that deep drive of purpose in terms of going forward, we need to remove what would pull you back. Right.
Hmm.
And so remove that need for protection. And why is that there? And what does it think that it's protecting you from? And why is it registered in your system as unsafe? And so a lot of us, as you said, you can force your way through a lot of that just through sheer willpower, which a lot of people do, but it comes at a cost. It comes at a
Yep.
huge cost, whether in terms of relationship stress. Like a lot of people go on to achieve things, and that whole journey was miserable,
Hmm.
right? Because you were just pushing through the things that you couldn't see, the things where you felt unsafe. And
Yep.
so that's why I love the idea of growth in terms of an objective over achievement, because it's just something that's so exciting to strive for, because it's endless. It's
Yep.
always endless.
Yeah, and there's two pieces of that explanation there around the design, which I think are really important. Like this idea of the cost. I think what it immediately does is it allows us to firstly understand that we should give ourselves the grace that this was in fact a design that came almost unbeknownst to us. Like it was
Correct.
happening without our awareness of. And at the
Hmm.
second time, it also allows us to get the costs out in front of the work to really anchor down why the work matters. Because that's a big part of the world that I operate in terms of how we coach today with our clients is this idea of how can we as quickly as possible get to the point of where we make the work matter, because without that, the accountability, the follow through, all this kind of thing is always going to be lacking. And so I think this idea of leading with the cost of the design helps a person suddenly go, you know what? There is so much more necessity around this work than I've ever been giving it credit, as opposed to saying, like, hey, look what can happen when we make it about performance design. We're going straight to the result of the benefit of, for me, and again, I'd love to kind of go back and forth with you here on this to get your opinion. For me, I think as humans, we seem to operate with greater consistency and intentionality when we just simply better understand the cost of the behavior as opposed to simply being incentivized to only the benefit of the behavior,
Correct.
if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one of the most important things for me, if I'm working with a client, is I don't fix clients. To suggest I
Right.
fix them is to suggest that they're broken. It's like, no,
Yeah.
in fact, I'm going to show you're working exactly the way you were designed to as a human being. It's just that
Mm-hmm.
no one has ever taken you through that step to understand it. And so now you feel like you're a victim of circumstances. No, if you understand the architecture of humans, you'll understand exactly why you're where you are.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, that's really, really important, because we're under the impression that when someone holds back or they fail, it's a character, it's the failure of character, right? It's character flaw. For me, it's no, that's the success of architecture. That's success of biology, right? And from that perspective, it just gives such a sense of relief for the people that I'm working with who've for so long thought like I can't handle pressure or like my confidence is broken. It's like, no, not at all. In fact, I hate to be the one to tell you, because I know mom and dad told you you're special, but from what I can see, you're just normal like everyone else.
Right.
Right. And so that just gives a release. And then even from the perspective of when I look at some of the performance arenas, let's say confidence or focus, we're just like, here's how you focus as an example. Here's some tools to help you focus. I like to say, here's what stole your focus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here's where protection showed up and pulled you into the past to think about the mistake that you made because it was a threat to your identity and you needed to track it closely, and why you're worried about the future, because you're where you're not safe. Your protective system has already projected the worst case scenario in relation to your identity to save you from that. But now we as athletes or performers in general, we're not performing from a place of neutrality. We're performing from a place of, we already seen a future that we don't like, and now we're actively trying to avoid that future, right? And you can see how that starts to create the constraints, the tension, the pressure that a lot of us experience when it comes to performance.
Yeah, there's such a huge part of awareness in all of this. Just again, and awareness is a topic, is a discipline in itself. It's something I'm just enormously drawn toward just in the work I do, but also just as a student of the work I do too. I love learning about awareness. I I want you to help our listeners better understand when it comes to awareness as a skill set. Why is it we need to make it a skill set? Because the research that I've read is that 90% of us think we're aware, and yet only about 10% of us actually are. And so for you in your work, what does awareness do for the person that you're working with? And then maybe that can help our listeners understand as to why we should even be prioritizing the development of awareness as a skill in itself.
Yeah, for me, when you talk about awareness, I say this all the time. Awareness is the greatest mental skill you can have. It's a superpower because through awareness, you have choice. Through choice, you have power. Through power, you can create change. But it all starts from a place of awareness. And one of my favorite quotes is one by Carl Jung, which is, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And, that is really the reality of most people, is that they're completely, you know, unaware of some of these subconscious constraints as we talk about. And so the patterns show up and they just think that that's who they are, their limitations, or that's just the way that the dice rolled for them in particular. But that's not the case. And so in terms of awareness, again, I think we do such a poor job of actually showing, educating people in terms of how we're designed. Right. And so, even from the perspective of, your thoughts, I often, when I talk with athletes in the first conversation we have, and we start talking about their mind and the narrative in their mind. And I ask them, I was like, did you think that was you? And they're like, yeah. And, I'm like, no, that's not you.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just blown away. They're like, what? I was like, no, that's not you. And then I start to tell them, is this what it's saying? Yeah, makes a lot of sense based on some of the constraints that you have here and some of the areas you need to protect. It's just saying whatever it has to say to protect you.
Mm-hmm.
Just like your mom and dad said whatever they had to say to push you forward because that's what they wanted. Your mind, that narrative, is saying whatever it needs to say to keep you safe from where your identity doesn't feel safe to be exposed. That's it. And it will use fear. It will use doubt. It will use comparison. It will use judgment. That is not random. Those are not random. Those are all patterns. And we need to teach people how to become aware of these patterns because those very patterns are showing them where they're not free, where they're not safe, where performance is constrained.
And so the patterns, I have to assume, they lead us to that eventual ability to perform, like to actually step into the limelight and say, like, hey, listen, once I now better understand, have that awareness of the patterns of behavior that take me into this more predictable, safe space, I am now relearning new patterns that allow me to step into a performance arena and actually be the performer I'm aspiring to be.
Yeah, and as you said, in terms of reverse engineering, let's say for someone, we'll use a young athlete as they can perform, but there's certain, I'm inconsistent. Well, let's look at that. Where there's something consistent about the inconsistency. Let's dive into that, and you can start to see, well, hey, what was different here? I was like, oh, yeah, and that one there, my dad drove me instead of my mom. Okay, what's something there? Okay, and then you start to learn, well, in your system, it feels unsafe to disappoint your dad. Why? And we start to, okay. And then we start to track back to the original root of that. And we need to be able to separate what was real, because what you felt was real, but the conclusion that you drew from it, because that conclusion which sits in your system is the very thing that doesn't allow you to feel safe. So, for example, if dad is the source of my safety and he's not happy when I don't perform well, which means not performing well in front of my dad is unsafe, well, then guess what? As soon as I'm performing in front of my dad, my system comes up to the surface and says, hey, we need to protect you. And that starts to create the constraints and the tension and the overthinking, which causes the mistakes. And then we start to get stuck in these mental loops.
Yeah, and that's such a vital piece of information for anyone listening to this is this idea that the reality, the emotions that we have in that moment, that is in fact real. That is the reality that we are experiencing. But the interpretation of that's the bridge. That's the bridge that we have so much more control over when we can start to develop these patterns that you were alluding to.
Yeah, and people in different circumstances are going to trigger things in you, which is going to reveal to you where you're still constrained.
Yeah.
And so emotions. There's no problem with the emotion itself. It's the the charge of the emotion or the conclusion, the story that's attached to that emotion that's creating the problem, right? And so you
Mm.
can have a little bit of fear and doubt, and that's all part of being human. But when that fear and doubt says you are not safe to fully express yourself in this moment, that's when it starts to become the problem.
Yeah. No, such good stuff. And for me to return now to this idea of focus, this thought that I immediately have was that if we have this vision of ourselves, the performer, the optimal version of self, this person that we are so intentional now around becoming, what are some of the more typical standard day-to-day ways that you see a person's focus being stolen? I love the way you frame like that terminology. I think is truly fascinating and also fantastic at the same time, is this idea that our focus, we don't lose it, that it can in fact be stolen from us. So just walk us through maybe the ways in a performance setting how this focus may in fact be stolen.
Yeah, I'll look at it from from the performer of someone perhaps in business, right? Let's
Mm-hmm.
say, for example, someone who's, trying really to level up and step into a new version of themselves. Essentially, what you're telling your system is designed for safety first and foremost, and it's looking for things to stay familiar. So the moment you tell your system, I'm going to start to level up, your system says, well, that's not the version of us who stays safe. Okay. And so it is literally going to create different constraints. And so that might be, in terms of procrastination or convincing you, to scroll through your phone. Like you're about to go do something new and it's like, just scroll through your phone and you think that's just you or bad habits, but that's a very intentional protective mechanism keeping you from being able to grow into the next version of you, which is unfamiliar, which is unsafe. Ultimately, our system wants safety. And so we think that, we start to create these bad habits, but a lot of that is very intentional. The second part of that is in terms of performance. Like if I'm in a performance, you obviously know because you worked in the world of athletics, our responsibility is just going to be completely immersed in the moment. But again, where I feel unsafe, my system has to manage anything that is a threat to my identity. And if I just made a mistake, as an example, we talk about like a reset mistake. Here's a tool to reset after a mistake. My question is, why did that trigger you so much in the first place? Right?
Mm.
Like a mistake is a moment in time. It's just there to give you feedback, except where your identity is not safe. So now I'm going to give you a reset to help you manage that. But again, you're going to have to use that reset over and over and over again. Right.
Mm.
And so to the extent that you're not safe, your system literally has to manage the past and the future to keep you safe. And that's what pulls you out of the moment.
Mm. Yeah, it's a response system. Like that's kind of how I'm just interpreting all this. Like that ability to, yeah, like you said, we don't want to always rely upon a reset because the reset becomes a band-aid in many ways. But so the idea then becomes if we can respond differently. And I'm hearing just such an enormous amount of curiosity required. Curiosity comes up a lot on this show. But for someone to always stop and instead of going to that tendency of like, what is my reset process, blah, 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 like to just stop and go, why do I keep responding this way? Asking the harder question, because
Yes.
that question forces harder work. Like that's what and then, again, you don't ever have to excuse that on this show. Like we want to do the hard work. If you're listening to this show, it comes with listening to it. So for me to actually get to that point of, as we're talking here, it's like the acknowledgement that there are methods at the surface that we can utilize to move from a moment in time to the next moment in time. But for holistic growth to happen consistently over time, that ability to lean in and ask the harder questions sounds like a massive part of this.
Yeah, you nailed it exactly, right? And going back to that procrastination, someone who consistently procrastinates, right? We're like, oh, well, try this, in this 5-step process, and maybe it's this 3-step process. Try this one here. It's different systems, again, managing different ways of managing the symptoms. It's what's creating that procrastination in the first place, which at a deeper identity is that you don't feel safe. You don't believe that you can step into this version. And so your system is literally going to create the very circumstances to keep you small, to keep you safe. Okay. We are designed for protection first and foremost. We crave that purpose, right? And I often talk about a separation between who you are, in terms of the heart and soul of who you are versus, the protective system of who you are. And that system is designed to keep you small, to keep you safe. It doesn't care about your goals. And then you have this other part of you that is intuitive, as you talked about, in terms of your experience and wanting a little bit more. And that for me is the internal battle that we face. We tell athletes all the time, it's you versus you. And that's wonderful. But what does that mean?
Right.
What does that mean? And so my intention is I'm going to show you exactly what that is. Let me show you the protective version of you sitting in your system, pulling you back. Let me show you the purpose-driven version of you. And let me show you where that internal battle shows up in your self-talk, in your perspective, in your focus, in your confidence, in your resilience. I'm going to show you where it shows up in all the different arenas so that you understand what would intentionally hold you back, how to intentionally win that with purpose so that you can become someone who's wired for purpose, because right now you're still wired for that protection.
I mean, there's fewer better ways for us to potentially close this discussion out than that little summary right there, quite frankly, Jason, because this idea that, because again, it is so cliche in the world of sport, like, you know, every day it's you versus you, you're your biggest competitor, man in the mirror, all this stuff. And I always appreciate when people just kind of call it for what it is. Like, what does that actually mean? Like, my big terminology in the world of sport is trust the process. Like, I always push back. I say, what the hell does that actually mean? You know,
Correct.
like, so it's just one of those sayings that we get. It looks great in a reel, but can we just be real here? Like, what does that actually mean? And so for you to just say it is about the version of you that's protecting versus the version of you that wants purpose.
Correct.
And to understand that one of those things is active and one of those things is aspirational, and that aspirational version doesn't get to see the light of day if we don't deal with the actual version in the moment, that person who's protecting you from being the best version of you, that 9 times out of 10, sadly, is going to step aside when it goes up against that version of you that's aspiring to have purpose. Like, that's what I've taken from this entire discussion. So how do we reframe?
Correct. No, you can want something as much as you want, but if that protective system doesn't think that your identity is safe to experience it, it will not allow you to have it.
Mm-hmm.
Very simple. And it has various interesting weapons that it can use to pull you back down.
Yeah.
And you will, as you said, we'll call it fate. I just got unlucky. I keep getting unlucky. Do you? Do you keep getting unlucky? Or have you looked at the pattern? Because we're always under the impression that something external is blocking me from getting to that place, but it's not, right? Something internal is blocking you from getting to that place, and you need to start to see the patterns, and that is absolutely the difference. And yeah, that happens for a lot of athletes. It's you've trained for performance, but once pressure hit, protection won, because you haven't explored it, and it sits invisible, and it wins that battle as long as you don't bring it to the surface.
Yeah, such good stuff, man. And we've hit our listeners with so much information here. And so I would love for you to maybe just, if there were a starting point with any of this, like if you could just say, start here when it comes to this kind of work. If someone was to try to get practical with this kind of work effective immediately, what direction are you sending them in right now? What might be a good 1 or 2 steps for them to maybe start with?
I would say start to track, when your mind gets loud, and start to track the things that it says to you, and track when you get emotionally triggered and what were the circumstances for that. And anytime your nervous system activates, like, all of those is not random. Those are all because your system believes in that moment you require protection. And when you feel that, and when you think that, my question would be, what does my system think I require protection from in this moment? I'm afraid to fail. I'm afraid to be judged here. I'm afraid to have that conversation. That will start to reveal some of the areas where you're not free, where you don't feel safe. So the bigger question is not, why is this happening to me, which is what we typically ask.
Yep.
The question is, what does this situation think that I need protection from?
I'm glad you said this. I'm glad you said the question for a second time, so that anybody that went to go grab a pen doesn't have to rewind and listen to you say it again. So you got that question, folks, and it's a great question. It's going to help with awareness. It's going to help with you simply getting a feel for, if there were a level of performance that I'm trying to access, how adamant am I about answering that question, about collecting the information I need to that's necessary for me to make those initial steps, knowing that at every single juncture, every time you make that step, you're probably going to have to ask that question again. The stakes went up, the development went up, the expectations went up, everything keeps going up. So that's an evergreen question, which I love about it, so that you can keep coming and revisiting this idea of shifting from the protector to the performer, to the person of purpose. I love it.
You nailed it. I couldn't have said it any better. So thank you.
Yeah. So, man, listen, I knew this would be good. It's a page filler. I always say to folks, like, I'm always taking notes, and sometimes I will fill a page and need to sort of turn up the page at the bottom and write a few notes on the back of it. This was one of those episodes where I ran out of page on one side and needed to move to the second. And so I just appreciate the generosity of insights. But Jason, before I let you go, please let our listeners know if they want more and more of Jason Sousa, where we might go for that.
Yeah, I typically share all my stuff on Instagram, which is Jason A. Sousa or Coach J. You can find me, or also known as the Performance Architect, as you mentioned. I also have a website, which is getyourmentaledge.com, where I have a lot of information in terms of how I help athletes, and hopefully one day I'll get to share my message on bigger stages and be able to connect with your audience a little deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we can talk about that offline, but there's some plans in the work for the future for how I can do what I do on a bigger stage as well, and get the kind of folks like you who can bring value to those stages. So we'll talk about that. But Jason, if this was a step towards you becoming at the best of what you do, as you alluded to at the beginning, man, I'm glad that I got to be part of one of those steps along the way. But listen, again, thanks for the generosity of the insights, and just best of luck with all your work, brother.
No, and likewise, someone who genuinely really appreciates the work that you do and the stuff that you're putting out there. And I think we need it so much. And there's a lot of that raw and push through. And it's nice to know that there's people who's actually giving some real context behind the message. So thank you for the work you do.
Appreciate that.